Thank you very much for all of you who have come today at a rather short notice to talk a bit about, well, fiscal policy more narrowly, but maybe more generally about what is happening in the European Union, some relatively recent ideas about the Euro Plus Pact, which was previously called Competitiveness Pact, and maybe some issues that unite the positions of the Bulgarian government and your government and your economists about what should the common, or perhaps the lack of common, tax policy be like in Europe in the next decades. So I'll start talking about Bulgaria, but I'm sure that you'll find lots of parallels between what I'm describing is the tax and fiscal policy in Bulgaria. You'll find lots of parallels to your own country. I'll start with a more general view also of economic crisis by first noting that if one studies the economic history of the last 250 years, there are very good studies on that, one would notice a certain periodicity with which major economic crises come about. In fact, and there are some studies by Kenneth Rogoth and co-authors, they've looked at the last 250 years of economic history and have discovered that an economic crisis of major proportions comes every about dozen years. So that, and if you go back in time, even from a European perspective, this roughly holds true. So you do remember the 97-98 East Asia crisis, which affected also some other countries in Latin America, like Argentina, affected Russia, affected quite a number of smaller countries. You go back to the 80s, you remember the 1994-1995 tequila crisis in Mexico, and then all of Latin America. You remember earlier in the decade the so-called OPEC II crisis. In the 70s, you remember the first, so to speak, oil crisis. So if you go back in history, you would actually find this rather surprising at first periodicity. Every about dozen years, a major crisis takes place in the world. Some of these major crises are more regional in nature, like the East Asia crisis, although, as I mentioned, it had fairly large implications for Latin America, for Russia, for a few other countries in the region. In that regard, the latest crisis that we're just coming out of will remain in the history books as one of the major crises. But still, every dozen years a crisis happens in the world. The same studies also point out some rather more optimistic fact, which is that on average this crisis lasts about 2 to 2.5 years. And no matter how difficult this period is, no matter how hopeless, new, and so on this crisis look, in about 2 to 2.5 years, actually the world or the region or the countries in this crisis actually come out of them and enjoy a period of about a decade, if you remember the dozen years to a crisis of growth. Which points out, I think, to two things, that when one enters a crisis, one should just count back in time and not be so surprised. And also that one should think that because crises come, but they also last for a relatively limited time on average, and they pass, one should stick to the fundamentals that have made their economy successful before that. So crisis really shows that there is an issue, but also one needs to remember that there are fundamentals that have made you successful before, and you shouldn't somehow lose them in trying to resolve this particular crisis. So today I'll mostly talk about some of these fundamentals, at least in the case of Bulgaria, which I think happen to be very similar fundamentals to what Ireland has had and has enjoyed great success over the last at least couple of decades. So two facts or three facts to remember so far. Every dozen years a crisis. It lasts about 2.5 years. And let's not forget the fundamentals that made you successful before the crisis. In Bulgaria, I would argue that over the last decade or 15 years, there are two such fundamentals in the financial fiscal policy of the country. The first was, I would say, de facto joining the Eurozone, although not quite. What do I mean? In 1997, so almost 15 years ago, Bulgaria decided to have a currency board, a fixed exchange rate first to the Deutsche Mark, and then when the euro was established, to the euro. And for the last 15 years, while we do have our own currency, the lef, it has been pegged without any changes in this peg, essentially to the euro. And that has been the policy now for 4 or 5 governments. That would remain the policy of the Bulgarian, certainly of our government and of other governments that follow before we actually join the euro. So in that regard, this anchor, let's say, of the monetary policy has made us very similar, in fact, to other countries like Ireland. In Bulgaria, what it has meant throughout these years is a lot more stability. 15 years ago, there was a major financial crisis. About 40% of our banking sector essentially was liquidated. Another third went through very painful restructurings of the type that some of your banks now will be undergoing. And that brought a lot of fear into the population, into politicians, that somehow it's better to have a monetary policy kind of decided, if you like, outside of Bulgaria, and hence the currency board arrangement that by now is very highly regarded by the population at large. In fact, over the years, there are many sociological surveys, I'm sure there are also such surveys in Ireland, that ask the question, what are the institutions that you trust most in your country? And in Bulgaria, the number one most trusted institution is the currency board arrangement. And then you go down the list, and the judiciary is the least trusted, which is another problem, but we will not speak about it today. So this is one of the fundamentals that has made Bulgaria a relatively successful country over the last 15 or so years. The other fundamental is the tax regime, the tax policy of the country that over the last 4 governments has gradually moved from very high tax rates, started with about 42-44% corporate tax rate in 97-98, and lots of exceptions, lots of exemptions for various sectors, various companies, various investors, and so on. In 2007, Bulgaria introduced what's called a flat tax rate, 10% corporate income tax, 10% personal income tax, 10% dividend tax. And since 2007, the previous government, interestingly, while this discussion was ongoing for about 10 years before actually getting to the 10% income tax, it was the previous government, which was a socialist-led government, that in fact introduced the flat tax of 10%. Our government, which came into power about 20 months ago, managed to keep the corporate income tax at 10%, which we regard as our main successes so far. But I'll come to this in a minute in describing what we have done. But because of this movement for about the same amount of time, 15 years, 4 successive governments have basically been stating that as a small open economy, Bulgaria needs a lot of foreign direct investment in this, if you like, initial economic development phase. To do that, and also to avoid having lots of business activity in the informal economy because of high, complicated administratively taxes. These were the 2 main reasons that 4 successive governments argued that Bulgaria should have a low taxes, flat taxes, and we achieved this about 5 years ago. This is important because, like the currency board arrangement that I just mentioned, has a very high, if you like, approval rating among institutions. The flat corporate tax rate and the low tax rate of 10% also enjoys very high approval, which is understandable among businesses, but also among the population at large and among the major political parties. So in Bulgaria, currently, and I think that is going to be the case in the future, no significant political party argues that somehow Bulgaria should go back to some sort of a progressive tax rates with exemptions for certain industries and so on. So there seems to be a significant share of consensus on this issue as well, which I'll explain later in our talk, makes Bulgaria one of the key allies, if you like, of Ireland, perhaps the key ally, I would argue, in terms of explaining to some of the larger countries in the European Union, the European institutions themselves, why having a harmonized either tax rate or tax base or harmonized tax system in Europe is not a good idea if one wants a good cohesion policy in the European Union. Our basic argument is that different countries in Europe have different stages of development, have different characteristics, different competitive advantages. This, we believe, happens to be one of our Bulgaria's major competitive advantages, and we are not willing to let it go just because some other countries think that they should develop their own competitive advantages at the expense of Bulgaria or some other countries in the region. As in nearly every country in Europe, when the crisis hit, revenues fell. And in Bulgaria, there was a discussion, but I think not very fortunately for us, not a very significant discussion, or maybe we should increase tax rates. Mostly, actually, the discussion was on the VAT rate, not on the corporate or personal income tax rate, just to, if you like, have more revenues to be able to spend, as in every other country there was this discussion. In fact, over the last 2 years, 2009 and 2010, 24 out of the 27 EU members increased either the VAT tax or the corporate income tax or the personal income tax, one of their significant taxes. So there are only 3 countries, including Bulgaria, that did not do that. In Bulgaria, we had that debate in late 2009, early 2010. As I mentioned, it was focused on the VAT rate, which in Bulgaria is 20%, whether to increase it to, let's say, 22 or 23 or even maybe 24%. And the Ministry of Finance, the government, successfully argued the position that that is just going to kill the economic growth that is just about to come, and therefore we should not do that. That position prevailed in Parliament, and we did not change our VAT rate, nor the other taxes for that matter. Our neighbors, however, did. Romania increased significantly both the corporate income tax rate and the VAT rate, as did Greece in 3 steps. You are quite familiar probably with the Greek story, but last year on 2 occasions, and then late in 2009 also on 1 occasion, the VAT rate went from about 18%, the average VAT rate, to now about 26%, 25 and 26% in some industries. And the corporate tax rate also rose by about 4 to 5 percentage points cumulatively over this last year and a half. In Romania, the VAT rate went from 19% to 24% in 1 step, however, and the corporate income tax went from 16%, I think, to 18%. This gives us, as economists, not only as politicians, but as economists, an opportunity to see what happens if you actually, during a crisis, increase the tax rates. What happened is that both countries, Greece and Romania, had negative economic growth, or in other words, they had economic decline in last year, 2010. Among the very few countries in the world, actually, if you look at the world as a whole, there are only about 4 or 5 countries with negative economic decline in 2010. Both Romania and Greece are among them. And somewhat more interestingly for Bulgaria in terms of so-called neighborhood effect, we started getting lots of Greek and Romanian companies registering in Bulgaria, so just across the border. paying taxes in Bulgaria, and lots of Romanian and Greek shoppers coming to our stores, which is not what we intended to do, of course. It was not our policy, but it's interesting from an economic perspective to see what happens if somebody increases taxes. What you'd expect, demand falls, people go more in the informal economy, and the countries that withstand this pressure, because they think that it's their fundamental competitive advantage, like Bulgaria, actually benefited from this. I'm glad to say that since the middle of 2010, the Bulgarian economy started recovering. So we now have had nearly 4 quarters of some economic growth, which gives us enough reason to believe that our tax policy is going to remain as has been the case so far. In the meantime, however, the European Union as a whole, or some institutions within the European Union and some member states, have, let's say, used the crisis maybe, because this is not a new idea, to raise the issue of, well, maybe Europe should have a common, maybe common is a strong word, but a harmonized tax policy. This debate is not new. I was reminded earlier today that even in the 70s, this idea of common fiscal policy existed. I'm told that about 10 years ago, it was quite a large debate in various ECOFIN meetings of finance ministers, but didn't get very far. And now it has appeared in the guise of first the so-called Pact for Competitiveness that Germany and France, surprisingly, I think, to almost everybody in the European Union, announced. And then in several follow-ups, what's now called the Euro Plus Pact, which I'm sure would turn into Euro Plus Plus, Euro Plus Plus Plus, and so on. Those of you who are familiar with this pact probably can say that there are a few quite meaningful, good things in it. A roughly more disciplined fiscal approach of all member states, more responsible, let's say, social policy in terms of pension reform. But there is one thing that certainly bothers Bulgaria, our government, a lot, and I think that has caused a lot of indignation, let's say, in some other countries, including Ireland, and certainly, I would say, among all economists who know anything about tax policy and fiscal policy. And that is the part that is focusing, as I said, on harmonized. First, it was tax rates. It was somewhat more veiled, but tax rates. Then it went to tax base, the language, and now it's actually even more amorphous than that. It basically says something like to work towards a future harmonized tax system in Europe, which nobody quite knows what that means, but it sounds slightly worrisome. First, because tax policy belongs to the sovereign governments and member states. That's expressly stated. And secondly, because it raises the issue, so who's going to benefit and who's going to lose from that? And I'll finish my presentation just with a few thoughts on that. So roughly as I see it, and this is also the position of our government that has been written and sent to the EU presidency, the initial idea was pitched by governments that do have high tax rates, however with lots of exemptions for particular companies, for particular industries and so on, that roughly speaking say, well, there are some other countries, smaller countries, that have more conducive to business tax rates, and that may prevent European competitiveness. I'm paraphrasing how I feel that. And because of that, everybody should have our types of taxes. That's my reading. That didn't quite work well because a number of countries, including mine, including Ireland, Sweden, Finland, the UK, a number of the other East European countries said, well, wait a minute. First of all, that's a sovereign issue, the tax policy. And secondly, although everybody was quite diplomatic in presenting it, but roughly the point was, Isn't this benefiting very few countries at the expense of everybody else? Let's talk about this more. So then in the second iteration of this discussion, what was, well, maybe we're not going to talk about tax rates, but let's talk about the tax base, which sounds a lot more, a lot less dangerous, let's say. Sounds almost like it's a good idea, except that it's not. And why it's not that in the discussion of the tax base there are several issues, but there are two large issues in the current, at least, in the current version. One is the difference between the nominal tax rate and the effective tax rate, that some countries have high nominal tax rate. Germany is an example, France is an example, but with lots of exemptions. And if you account for these exemptions, actually their taxes, effective taxes, are significantly lower. Because of the exemptions, partly maybe because of the administration of the tax regime and so on. Other countries, in which both your country, Ireland, and Bulgaria belong, have low nominal tax rate, but the effective tax rate is almost the same as the nominal one because we don't have exemptions. So in Bulgaria, I mentioned we have a 10% corporate income tax rate. The effective tax rate is something like 9.6, 9.7%. We have, because we have no exceptions. In Ireland, I've seen the numbers. It's somewhat similar example. So it leads to the discussion, okay, if we have a common tax base over time, are you going to get rid of the exemptions that you have? Or are you going to, in some way, encourage us, of course, indirectly to have exemptions ourselves, because otherwise it would be difficult for our tax system to adjust to yours. This is one conversation that is coming up, but already a number of good economists have opined on this, that once you choose your tax system without exemptions, you can allow yourself to have a lower tax rate. If you choose a system with lots of exemptions and you can administer it, because some countries are successful at that, some other countries are not. Bulgaria was not in the past, and that's why we decided to have a low tax rate but no exemption. And the other issue, which is, I think, going to be a lot more, let's say, politically sensitive and interesting to discuss, is the issue of, okay, if you have a common tax base, suppose that you have in the future, what happens, how do you tax the profitability, if you like, of international companies that may operate in a country like Bulgaria or Ireland or the Czech Republic, but part of their profits are derived from selling in Germany or France or Italy and so on, which you'd expect from small countries that have smaller markets to grow through exporting, and hence to have some share at least of their production be exported and sold abroad. And that, I think, is the other fundamental question that currently is not that much discussed, because once you go into that line of thinking, it's obvious who would benefit, and it would be the countries with the larger markets, in Europe at least, and it's obvious who would lose out of this kind of debate, which would be the countries that do grow through exports, these are the small open economies, but through this kind of a harmonization of a tax base may actually stand to lose. So I look forward to having this sort of discussions in the ECOFIN of finance ministers, in the various other institutions that will be focusing on this over the next few months. And I'll close with that, but perhaps importantly, earlier this morning I had the chance to meet with both your Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and we exchanged views of how in this kind of debates, to some extent, if you like, economic debates, but to some extent fundamental debates about what kind of a system you would like to run. Ireland and Bulgaria have many common characteristics, many common interests, as do a few other countries in Eastern Europe, in the Nordic region, and that we together should put our minds and persuasion abilities to be able to convince whoever needs to be convinced that while the current system needs improvement, this is not one of the directions that we'll all benefit from. Thank you very much.